Thank you, Anthony. Do you know, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's not that long, well, actually, it is quite a while since I was sitting where you are sitting now. So I hope that in a few years, some of you will be on this side of the podium speaking to the next generation of students. And I commend you for sparing a weekend to hear lots of lectures. I mean, it's bad enough being a student hearing lots of lectures. I was awful at listening to lectures when I was at university. I remember the first week of term being pretty enthusiastic about the course I was doing and going to a lecture by Professor Edwards, and it was the most boring, mind-numbingly tedious lecture I've ever heard in my life, and it put me off lectures forever. And as I was walking out, I fell in line with a girl I hadn't spoken to before, and I was venting about just how dull and boring the lecture was. And she said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" I said, "No." And she goes, "I'm Professor Edwards' daughter." And it's one of those moments that you want the earth just to swallow you up. And she said, "Well, he'll be really pleased to know how much you're looking forward to the classes over the next year." And I said to her, "Well, you don't know who I am, do you?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, we better keep it like that." But enough of reminiscing of those happy days. Today's talk focuses on what I've learnt from an exceptional pro-life advocate, Alison Davis. And it's possible that you're not familiar with her, although she was well known in the pro-life movement for 30 years until her death in December 2013. I had the privilege of being her assistant for the last 24 and a half years of her life. Alison, I will in fact call her Ali, which I think she would prefer to be known as. Ali was an extraordinary woman. She was born with spina bifida. She was a wheelchair user, and even though she was in considerable pain and had difficulties throughout her life, she probably achieved far more, travelled more widely than most of us would expect to do in our lifetime. She had been pro-abortion and an atheist who somewhat reluctantly came to accept the pro-life position in the early 1980s, and about 10 years later she became a Catholic. She suffered much, but came to see suffering as an immense privilege. In fact, she described it as the greatest privilege possible in this world. And I wonder how many of us could say that. And I think it gives an insight into just how an extraordinary woman that she was. She loved much. She was a serious person with a great sense of fun, and she was a generous and loyal friend. She was, in my view, one of the greats of the pro-life movement, which is why I want to speak about her today. Now, Ali loved much because she was profoundly aware of the infinite value of each human being. Now, I don't intend to repeat what I said at a previous SPUC conference, but as Anthony kindly mentioned, it is included in the booklet which is in your conference pack, so I'll leave it for you to read it if you want to. Now, though I was absolutely opposed to abortion before I met Ali, nevertheless, she very much shaped my thinking, and I want to share that with you this morning. In some ways, things are significantly different now from what they were 30 plus years ago when I was first involved in the pro-life movement. Over the past 30 years or so, issues such as those surrounding IVF and embryo research, cloning, assisted suicide, voluntary euthanasia have broadened the scope of pro-life concerns. When I was first involved, the focus was on abortion, and it seemed to me that the main issue was to convince others about the humanity of unborn children. What I saw as the hard questions, what if the child is disabled or if pregnancy occurs following rape, seemed to me to be kind of side issues. From Ali, I learned that what I thought were side issues are in fact the central issue, which should be at the heart of our concerns as pro-lifers. And that is what I want to focus on today. Now, before Anthony made his comments, I'd been interested to hear from people what they thought about the Woodcutter's Acts, because they were saying they'd never come across a pro-life talk talking about the Woodcutter's Acts, and they wondered, was it part of a series, Alison Davis and the Philosopher's Stone, Alison Davis and the Chamber of Secrets? And well, I said, well, no, it's not, but if there's a possibility of making millions out of them, I'll be quite happy to do a series like that. No, nothing to do with that kind of series. And someone else asked whether I was making a link between the pro-life movement and environmental concerns. And in fact, if we are concerned about the environment, then our first concern should be about the well-being of human beings for whom the environment exists. But that's also not the focus of my concerns. As Anthony began to say, there was a tale by Aesop about the trees and the axe. And Ali used it as the starting point of an article that she wrote several years ago, and it seemed to me a good way to highlight the point that I want to get across today. And the tale is short enough to tell it fully now. It's just an illustration of a woodcutter with an axe, just to illustrate the point I'm saying, which is totally meaningless really, but I thought I would do something for the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so here is Aesop's tale of the trees and the axe. A woodman went into the forest and begged of the trees the favour of a handle for his axe. The principal trees at once agreed to so modest a request and unhesitatingly gave him a young ash sapling, out of which he made the handle he desired. No sooner had he done so than he set to work to cut down the noblest trees in the wood. When they saw the use to which he was putting their gift, they cried, "Alas, alas, we are undone, but we are ourselves to blame. The little we gave has cost us all. Had we not sacrificed the rights of the ash, we might ourselves have stood for ages." It's a short story, and I've got a feeling that most, not all of you, can see the immediate application of this tale to pro-life concerns. During the past few decades, anti-life practices have come about by what seems like a very modest appeal for the handle of the axe. But once that handle is given, it inevitably leads to widespread destruction. So abortion was, of course, liberalised in Great Britain nearly 50 years ago as a result of the Abortion Act, which was passed in 1967. There were in the reign of 200,000 abortions each year in England, Wales and Scotland as a result. Before 1967, abortions took place by and large as a result of a court judgment of 1938. A London gynaecologist, Dr. Alec Bourne, was on trial for having performed an abortion on a 14-year-old girl who had apparently been gang raped by soldiers. He was acquitted at the trial, and the judge's summing up, in which he interpreted the law as allowing abortion if the likely consequence of continuing pregnancy would make the woman a physical or mental wreck, meant that in the following years, this could be cited as a justification for obtaining an abortion. Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a well-known commentator, described the judgment in the Dr. Bourne case as making straight the way to abortion on demand. Now, currently in Northern Ireland, which is not covered by the 1967 Abortion Act, statistics indicate fewer than 100 abortions taking place each year. And the legal precedent of the Bourne case, which still applies there, would account for most of them. In recent years have been attempts to clarify the abortion law in Northern Ireland, which have been resisted, thankfully. The realistic concern has been that any clarification would result in more abortions, as did the 1967 Act in mainland Britain. Can I pause briefly and ask, is it possible for a glass of water? Thank you. Okay, the 1967 Abortion Act claimed to be merely clarifying that for the sake of her physical or mental health, a woman might obtain an abortion, but in effect, it liberalised abortion. It also made it legal to abort if there was substantial risk of the child being born seriously handicapped. During the previous decade, many thousands of babies were born with disabilities such as undeveloped limbs after their mother had taken the drug thalidomide for morning sickness during pregnancy, unaware of the disabling side effect, and this was highlighted as a particular justification for abortion. In fact, so-called hard cases have typically been used to liberalise abortion laws. Recently, the outbreak of the Zika virus in Brazil, which you'll have heard about, spread by a particular type of mosquito which appears to have resulted in many women giving birth to children with the condition microcephaly, has been cited as a reason to allow abortion. Just last month, there was an attempt in Northern Ireland to legalise abortion if pregnancy arises after rape or incest, or if the child was expected to be so disabled that he or she would die shortly after birth. Thankfully, the attempt to introduce those abortions was unsuccessful. And at the end of life, a similar strategy has developed with advocates for euthanasia, not promoting what they really want, but trying to make inroads by presenting what appear to be more modest proposals. The reality is that once we give way on the principle of absolute respect for each human life, whether in his or her mother's womb or at any time before natural death, then the right to life of each and every human life is in jeopardy. This was certainly borne out by the 1967 Abortion Act. It was passed in October of 1967, but didn't come into effect until 6 months later in April 1968. And during that 6-month period, before he realised just how the Act would be implemented, one of the leading opponents of the new law, the Member of Parliament, Norman St John Stevens, took some satisfaction in the fact that the enacted bill was, as he said, greatly improved from its original form, well drafted and limited in scope. Now, he thought it was limited in scope, but in fact it resulted in 200,000 abortions each year. Okay, so what's my point? There are two. One is that some laws, such as the Abortion Act, can be interpreted in such a way that what seems to be restrictive on paper is actually interpreted liberally. You can see to what appears to be limited abortion, you get widespread abortion. The other point is that even if the law is not interpreted liberally, once you give way on the principle of absolute respect for life, say by allowing abortion for rape or for the most serious disability, the very abandonment of that principle paves the way for further disregard for human life in the future. In fact, Dr. Alec Bourne, who performed the abortion on the 14-year-old girl in 1938, became a founder member of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children nearly 30 years later and regretted the consequence of his actions. Now, at times, Ali would be almost tearing her hair out at some of the things said, not just by pro-abortion people, but by pro-lifers. This was because they failed to understand an important distinction, the distinction on the one hand between moral arguments or principles and on the other practical arguments or points of information. I'll give you an example. You'll probably know that prejudice against disabled unborn children is particularly acute, with women coming under much pressure to be screened during pregnancy to discover whether it is likely that their child would be disabled, and they come under strong pressure then to abort if disability is detected. More than 90% of babies with spina bifida, the condition Ali had, are aborted. Now, sometimes the screening results are wrong. You get what are called false positives when the test detects a disability, suggests there is a disability, but in fact there isn't. And there are also false negatives when tests do not detect a disability, but in fact the child is disabled. Any number of times, good pro-life people would come up to Ali and tell her that screening shouldn't be allowed because they knew somebody who was told that their child would be born disabled. They refused abortion and discovered the child wasn't disabled. And any number of times people would highlight the existence of false positives as the reason for opposing screening for disability. And it's a wonder Ali had any hair left in her head the number of times she heard that. Now, while it is, of course, true and something to be taken account of, the fact that there can be incorrect screening results is just a point of information. It's not a decisive moral argument against screening. While we can and should point out as a point of information that there are false positives, our objection to screening, followed by abortion, is that disabled babies are being discriminated against and killed, and our concern is to defend their right to life. So similarly, please do not conclude from what I've already said that the problem with the law allowing limited abortion is that it will be liberally interpreted or that it will pave the way for more widespread abortion. Yes, this will happen. It's something we can rightly state as a point of information. But the reason pro-lifers are opposed to even very limited abortion is that we uphold the right to life of each and every unborn child. Now, shortly after she became pro-life in the 1980s, Ali was asked to work for what was then called SPUC's handicap division. As I mentioned, a clause of the Abortion Act refers to allowing abortion in case of handicap, and this group within SPUC was made up of disabled people and their families and carers with a view to highlighting the eugenic aspects of the abortion law. Some years ago, the name was changed to what it is now, No Less Human. As Ali's assistant, I got to know the members of No Less Human, among whom now are some very good friends of mine. And the reality is that I would be much poorer if I didn't know them, if I didn't know Ali. And nowadays, a child is given a medical label before it's born. And this medical label in itself is seen as sufficient justification for ensuring that the child never sees the light of day. But Ali was not a spina bifida. Maria, in the picture, is not a Down syndrome. Rachel is not a hydranencephaly. And Lucy, who lived for just one day, is not an anencephaly. Their medical condition describes them only partially, but the description that matters is that they are living human beings who should be accorded the rights and status that their humanity requires. Our society is much poorer if we think certain types of people, those with physical and mental disability, should not be part of it. And a talk I'm particularly looking forward to today is Catherine Macmillan's talk, where she'll be talking about her beautiful daughter. And fittingly, her presentation is called The Gift of Life. Human life is such a great gift, and some of the greatest gifts of humanity I have known are members of No Less Human and other disabled people, including profoundly disabled people. Now, I won't dwell on this now, because Catherine will be speaking compellingly about this later, but it's something that must be at the forefront of our concerns. And Ali's work with No Less Human focused not just on people with disability, that was the understandable focus. She was also a particular advocate for other marginalised unborn children, particularly those conceived after rape. In fact, she was critical of the way a leading pro-lifer, while on an extensive overseas lecture tour, dealt with questions about rape. When asked, what about rape, this speaker's response was, if abortion were legal only for rape of the mother, if abortion were only legal for the rape, for rape or for the life of the mother, I wouldn't be here. I'd be home in England with my husband. Ali wasn't impressed with such a dismissive attitude to that question about rape. Of course, pro-lifers are sometimes asked the question, what about rape, in such a way that the question doesn't really care about the answer. But Ali felt strongly that we must always be willing to give the answer, which is truthful and genuinely compassionate. So I want to say a little about this now. I can say neither that abortion after rape is acceptable, or that the problem with allowing it lies in what it might lead to. If we do, we are doing a disservice to two people, both of whom deserve our compassion, our care, our truthfulness. The child is an innocent victim, an infinitely valuable human being with the right to life no less than any other human being, and shouldn't be punished with the ultimate punishment, capital punishment, for the crimes of his or her father. The mother too deserves our compassion and truthfulness, and it is not compassionate or truthful to turn a blind eye to, or to collude and let alone to encourage a mother's rejection of her child. Of course, rape is a terrible act, and it is understandable that a woman would not want to be pregnant after rape. And I would hope it goes without saying that it isn't for me or for anyone else to judge a woman who has aborted a child conceived after rape or for any other reason. But many women have found that giving birth and either continuing to raise their child or allowing a loving couple to raise their child through adoption has enabled them to discover healing through love rather than the further harm that comes from the destructiveness of abortion. Valerie Gatto, who was Miss Pennsylvania in 2014, was conceived in rape, and when her mother was 19. And at a young age, her mother explained to her, "Something bad happened to me. A very bad man hurt me, but God gave me you. Valerie was a gift." And she believes her life can give hope to others and says, you cannot let your circumstances define your life. Yes, as a practical argument, as a point of information, it is true to say that allowing abortion after rape undermines the grounds for opposing other abortions. But that is not why we are opposed to abortion after rape. Our position, our moral argument, our principle is that abortion following rape, just as in any other circumstance, takes the life of an infinitely valuable human being who has a right to life, and it causes serious damage to the well-being of his or her mother. It's very quiet in here. Okay. So I want to turn now to the other end of life and the questions of assisted suicide and euthanasia, of which Ali was a prominent opponent. Okay, so I'm trying to emphasize the need to have integrity in our arguments, and especially the need not to concede an important part of our arguments that we give away the handle of the axe which causes further destruction. So what might be the handle of the axe here? There can be different handles, but a notable handle has already been provided to the euthanasiasts by judgments from the highest court in the land in 1993, determining that the life of a young man, Tony Bland, could be ended. In 1989, before many of you, I think, were even born, although I sadly remember it all too well, there was a terrible disaster at the Hillsborough football stadium in Sheffield. Perhaps you've heard of it. There was a crush on the terraces, and there were 95 deaths and many injuries. Among those injured was a young man, Tony Bland, who was then only 18, who was diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state. Now, Ali always used the more appropriate term persistent non-responsive state, as she refused to use a description which suggests somebody is a vegetable. Of course, the vegetable label is often used in a dehumanizing way in order to justify killing disabled people before or after birth, though I suspect that, like me, you have never seen or heard of a human being that looks remotely like a carrot or a broccoli or a turnip. Actually, I tell a lie, there's a broccoli at the back over there. So I love the way you look. I just said that nobody looks like a broccoli, and you just go and look. You know, where do we get these people? And I wasn't referring to Anthony either. Okay, anyway, in spite of being described as a human vegetable by newspapers like the Sunday Times, which really should know better, Tony Bland was definitely a human being who happened to be brain damaged and unable to communicate. He could have been fed in the usual way, but as is often the case, a system of tube feeding was introduced in order to make it easier to care for him. A couple of years after his accident, his doctor and parents decided that there was no further point to his life, and they went to the High Court and in due course to the House of Lords, where they obtained a judgment that his food and fluids could be removed. They were removed, and in March 1993, after 9 days without any food or hydration, Tony Bland died, as any of us would if we had been treated so inhumanely. Now, Tony Bland was the first adult victim of legally approved euthanasia in the UK, and the judgment about him resulted in other profoundly disabled patients also being killed, and they are still being killed. Of course, the judges didn't describe it as euthanasia, but engaged in a contorted logic. Sir Stephen Brown, the High Court judge who initially ruled on the case, said that Tony Bland could be starved to death because he was essentially already dead. Well, no, he wasn't. That was the whole point. Rather presumptuously, Sir Stephen Brown pontificated at the time that Tony Bland's spirit has left him, and all that remains is the shell of his body. Now, Ali always wondered, did this guy have a spiritometer, or what was the device he had that he could make a judgment like that? And I know perhaps it is a little bit disrespectful to have that little thing in the corner, but I hear this time and again, I keep thinking of Mr. T, and this is probably before your time, the A-Team and these wonderful things, and he would hear a thing like that, he would just go, fool! And that's how I feel when I hear these things. You know, these are meant to be the learned people, and they come up with the most ridiculous things like that. Sorry, vent is over. But in fact, for many years, euthanasia advocates had argued that this sort of ruling was a way to legalise euthanasia, and the Bland case represents a handle of the axe. An Australian advocate for euthanasia, Dr. Helga Kuze, famously set out their plan of action when she said, way back in 1984, if we can get people to accept the removal of all treatment and care, especially the removal of all food and fluids, then they will see what a painful way this is to die, and then in the patient's best interests, they will accept the lethal injection. That's their plan of action, and they have been remarkably successful in implementing it. So I won't say more about the Tony Bland case now, because there are many parallels between it and the terrible situation that Bobby Schindler and his family faced with his sister Terry. And we're privileged to have Bobby speaking with us this afternoon because we need to be aware of the importance of defending the right to life of the most profoundly disabled people like Terry, like Tony Bland. And as you'll know from the general points I've been making, there are serious implications of giving up on the right to life of those who may be regarded as the hard cases. If we give up on them, we lose the softer cases. But beyond those sorts of slippery slope concerns, our concerns as pro-lifers is for those infinitely valuable human beings who are regarded as the hard cases and who need and deserve our love, our compassion, our care, our protection. Now, having made the point that it is crucially important that we defend the right to life of the most vulnerable people like Tony Bland and Terry Schindler-Shivo, I want to flip things around a bit and note a particular curiosity and also express concern. So in recent campaigns on the more general question of assisted suicide and euthanasia, an argument has come to the fore that it shouldn't be legalised because of what are described as public safety concerns. There is a practical argument, a point of information, rather than an opposition based on moral argument or principle. The argument goes as follows. Yes, there may be some people who are clearly determined that they want to end their lives and who are in no way doing so under pressure from others. Nevertheless, if we change the law to enable them to end their lives, it will create such a change within society that before long, vulnerable people will feel that they are a burden and feel under a pressure, whether real or imagined, to volunteer to have their lives ended. In fact, it logically follows that non-voluntary euthanasia will happen if the law allows voluntary euthanasia. And you may ask, why is this? The answer is simple. And in fact, the evidence is clear from countries like Holland, which has had voluntary euthanasia for 30 years. Now, healthcare decisions are made on an understanding of what is in somebody's best interests. Those promoting voluntary euthanasia say it is in the person's best interests. Now, if you accept that being killed is in the best interests of somebody who can volunteer for it, then similarly, it will be decided that it is in the best interests of others who cannot volunteer for it. So yes, there is a practical argument against legalising euthanasia, that it is unsafe on grounds of public safety. And for some people, this, rather than any moral reasons or principled opposition, will be sufficient reason not to legalise it. But we who are opposed as a matter of principle have to be careful not to think, let alone to say, as Ali and I often heard it said, that the problem with voluntary euthanasia is that it will lead to involuntary euthanasia. That has been said time and time again. It is a reality, this will happen, but it is not the problem with voluntary euthanasia. And in fact, the curiosity to which I mentioned previously is that in the UK, at least, we started the other way round. We started with involuntary euthanasia for patients like Tony Bland, and this has become a means of bringing in voluntary euthanasia. So what I want to do in the time left is to highlight the real problem with voluntary euthanasia or freely chosen assisted suicide. So Ali spoke so compellingly for vulnerable people at the end of life because for a number of years, in fact 10 years, she herself wanted to die. During part of that period, she made attempts, serious attempts, to end her life and would have qualified for assisted suicide or euthanasia if at that time the law had allowed it. Thankfully, the law did not allow it. And over time, she found a reason to live and was glad that the law had not allowed her to be killed. So I'll play now a short video, just 2 minutes, from an interview shown on BBC's Newsnight programme in 2010, which will enable you to hear Ali herself explaining her personal reasons for being concerned about a euthanasia law.
I have several disabling conditions. Some I've had since birth, some have come on more recently. I have spina bifida and hydrocephalus, which I was born with, and spina bifida is why I use a wheelchair full time. I also have osteoporosis, brittle bones, emphysema, a breathing problem, and arthritis.
Over a 10-year period, Alison asked friends again and again to help her die. Again and again, they refused. So she attempted it on her own.
I tried to take large doses of painkillers and took other steps, which I thought would be enough. And then I lay down in bed and cuddled my favourite teddy bear, which I still have now, and I waited to die, and I thought I would. That's what I wanted, that's what I intended, and I was ready.
And then what changed? Where did you find the will to live?
Well, I suppose the story changes in that another person was added to my circle of friends, Colin, who also became my carer, my assistant.
Over a long period, she clearly wanted to end her life, and she saw me as an obstacle to achieving that. That her wheelchair would be beside her bed, and I would sit in her wheelchair and fall asleep for most of the night, sitting in her wheelchair, because I knew that she would take the opportunity to go off and harm herself if I wasn't there.
What has changed is my outlook on life. And I think back and I think, what would have happened if I had died then? And the truth is, I would have missed the best years of my life. And also, nobody would ever have known that the doctors were wrong in thinking I didn't have long to live. So I feel.
But she did. And Colin thinks
So you'll note from the video that Ali describes a range of disabling conditions that she had. She has spina bifida, osteoporosis, emphysema, arthritis. In spite of morphine, she was on a daily basis for many years in severe pain, had almost constant nausea. Doctors in the 1980s, when she made her suicide attempts, didn't think she had long to live. Now, I originally went to her home in Dorset for 2 weeks in the summer of 1989 and stayed on thinking that she wouldn't survive beyond the end of the year. In fact, Ali died more than 24 years later. So in the recent attempt in Parliament to allow so-called assisted dying, it was maintained that it would be allowed only for those in the last 6 months of life. Well, doctors can get it very wrong. And if there had been a law allowing Ali to take her life 30 years ago, when she wanted to, and if her life had been ended, nobody would have known that doctors were wrong. As they say, dead men and women tell no tales. Now, there have been several high-profile cases of disabled people, normally people who have become disabled later in life, saying that they want the so-called right to die. The media always treats them very sympathetically, but in fact, most of the high-profile campaigners do not, at that particular moment in time, actually want to die. A few do, but most don't. They say they want to have the opportunity to end their lives if, at a later period, they cannot take any more and want to die. Ali, in fact, did want to die there and then for a period of 10 years. She is, if anything, the most credible witness of someone who wanted to die. And what she says is particularly compelling, given her subsequent opposition to the so-called right to die. Now, for the first 5 or so of those years, she made attempts, fortunately unsuccessful, to end her life. From about 1990, she no longer tried to end her life, but nevertheless, she wanted to die. And then, totally unexpectedly, everything changed in 1995. She said to me one night, "You know, I think I want to live." And she said it was the first time in 10 years that she had even thought that. So what happened? Was she miraculously cured? Did her pain and sickness and disability and all her problems suddenly disappear? No, not at all. Ali expressed her will to live while we were in India. The night after leaving a small project for disabled children. Many of these children were crawling in the dust. They would be able to benefit surgery if funds were available. Through the project, they were getting the opportunity to go to school. They gathered around Ali, they called her mummy, they warmed her heart with love and hope. She realised she could do so much for them and other disabled children in the area, and she wanted to do it. It gave her a meaning to live. In fact, she set up a charity to support the children, subsequently visited them nearly every year. She learnt their language, Telugu. She could speak with the children, she could write to them in the language as well, and she loved them as deeply as any mother loved her children. Now, Ali's health, her pain, her sickness and other things did not improve. In fact, they got worse. But she had a reason to live. Now, about 25 to 30 people from the UK are currently going to Switzerland each year to end their lives. It's the only country which, to its shame, allows non-residents as well as residents to be killed there. It is, of course, a tragedy for even one person to do this, but the number of people really determined to do this is in fact very small when you consider that there are about 500,000 deaths each year in the UK. Media reports are generally very sympathetic towards disabled or ill people who end their lives or who want to take their lives, as though this course of action is totally understandable in these circumstances. The reality, however, is that for each high-profile case involving somebody with a terminal illness or chronic disability wanted to die, there are hundreds or thousands of other people with similar illnesses or disabilities who are not wanting to die. Merely having a terminal illness or chronic disability does not mean that one's life desires to be ended. And statistics indicate that in the UK each year there are 67,000 suicides. There are other failed attempts at suicide. And the vast majority of people who are trying to commit suicide or do commit suicide are not ill or disabled, but want to die for a range of reasons. They've lost a job, a relationship's broken down, they're in debt, or just find life no longer worthwhile living. And as a society, we invest a lot of time and effort, and quite rightly, to try to prevent these deaths. So even though individuals think that their lives have no purpose or value, we encourage them to live and do not facilitate their deaths. In fact, the vast majority of disabled and terminally ill people do not want to end their lives, just as the vast majority of people who are able-bodied and in apparent good health do not want to. But we have an alarmingly negative and prejudicial attitude towards the lives of terminally ill and disabled people. As Ali noted, if a non-disabled people wants to die, society encourages them to live. If a disabled person wants to die, society talks about facilitating their deaths. There is something deeply troubling about that. A law allowing people to end their lives, no matter how restrictive it might appear to be, will always be discriminatory and based on a view, a prejudice that their lives are not as valuable as the lives of others. Yes, any law will have further victims, others will become unsafe, but it's the denial of the value, dignity and status of those who want to die in the first place that is objectionable. I know better, I suspect, than most people how difficult it can be living with someone who, day in, day out, finds life so unbearable that they want to end it. There were tough times with Ali. It was often not pretty. Sometimes Ali's cries of anguish were so acute and loud that I feared that neighbours would hear and think I was hurting her or abusing her in some way. It's tough on family members and carers being with someone who wants to die, which also raises the question of whether our concern is to put the suffering person out of their misery, or whether we as onlookers want in fact to be put out of our misery because we find the situation so difficult. And a reality of all our lives is that things don't remain constant. Although there was for Ali, throughout that 10-year period, the underlying wish to die, inevitably one cannot stay in a state of anguish all the time. You get tired and worn out by it. Ali got through the day, generally working, keeping busy as much as possible. I did what I could to distract her when times were difficult, and humour helps, you know. I mean, even if you want to die, you can still find things funny. It is absolutely true. And, you know, if you can break up the day with distractions and buy lighter things, you know, it helps. These things didn't remove the underlying wish to die, but they allowed some light to penetrate the darkness in varying degrees. And it made living more bearable than it might otherwise have been. And then, of course, the light penetrated in an extraordinary and previously unimaginable way when we went to India. Now, in the absence of a law allowing her to be killed, I had the opportunity to encourage Ali to live, reminding her that her life had value even though it didn't seem to her that it did. She said that that encouragement made a difference to her. And I'm grateful that there was no law allowing assisted suicide or euthanasia. I mean, how on earth can vulnerable people who want to die re-establish a sense of their worth and a purpose in life if the law says that in their situation they are in effect right to want to die and that they can get whatever assistance they need to end it. Ali spoke of being eternally grateful that the Lord didn't allow her to end her life. And in due course, she died naturally on the 3rd of December 2013. And the last weeks and days and hours and minutes were precious. Certainly to her and certainly to me. And when people say it's just a short period at the end of life that they're thinking about with assisted suicide or euthanasia, it is such a lie to say that these moments can be done away with. As I say in the account of her last days in the booklet that you have, those last days were so incredibly precious. We get one life, and it's precious from our beginning at conception until our final dying breath, for each of us, without exception. So Ali emphasized the infinite value of each human being. She emphasized the implication of recognizing the infinite value of each human being, because it means that the deliberate killing of just one human being is as tragic and as unjust and as much to be mourned, as much to be condemned by pro-lifers as the killing of millions. And we who are pro-life must show by word and action that we uphold without compromise the right to life of each and all. And in short, what we must do is to do all that we can to make sure that the woodcutter doesn't have a handle for his axe.